What's up, Hoof listeners? Welcome back to the Hoof Podcast on Thursday nights. Welcome back to Roster Rescue, Part 3, right? Part 3 of the series, trying to get you ready for the NFL Draft coming up in 2 weeks. Hard to believe.
2 weeks. Woo, it's getting close, man. 2 weeks away. The anticipation, the rumors are flying every day. You got to love draft time, right? It's the anticipation, the build up every day until it actually happens.
Yeah.
It's pretty exciting.
Yeah, it's funny because, we made this grand plan. All right, let's make the case for every position group because, let's say 4 or 5 weeks ago, there was a case to be made for most position groups, right?
Right, yeah.
But now it's all receiver. So like when we get to offensive line, you're like, well, I think that's really not a need. Right. So I think we only need just 15, 20 minutes to talk about that. So that's why we put that at the end of the show here. But really, let's talk about receivers, right? That is the glaring hole for this team. And really what we want to get into is the scenarios of what the Bills could do here, right? There's rumors they could trade up. Another rumor from ESPN came out today that they could trade back. We already knew that. It's not necessarily reporting the news when you say the Bills could trade back. You're like, well, yeah, we already knew that. Like all options are on the table is what it seems like.
Well, it's going to be exciting when it comes to wide receiver and the scenarios. Like you said, you can do mock drafts all day long and come up with different scenarios. And could the Bills do this? Could they trade up? Could they stay there? Could they trade down? Everything is a wide receiver there. Who's there when they're picking? There's a ton of things to go through in anticipation of what's actually going to happen the night of the draft. And likely none of us are going to get it right. But it's interesting to at least play it out and say, what do we think the Bills are going to do, or what would we do in those scenarios, right? And that's what the draft time is all about. It's speculation until it actually happens.
Yes. And then it is also smoke season, right?
Yes.
There's just random reports for every team. The Giants want a quarterback, right? That's one I think is a smoke screen. Just teams throwing stuff out there to try to throw other teams off, right? And 2 weeks out from the draft, it's all smoke at this point. So that makes it really fun anyway, right? Kind of going through that and just getting to the basics of what are the actual options for the Bills to fill their roster needs. And in this case, receiver, weapon, right? That's kind of what the Bills need to be after.
Big time, yeah.
All right, kicking it off. Can you and I agree that the Buffalo Bills roster rebuild is different than Kansas City's roster rebuild? This is what I keep hearing.
Yeah.
Oh, well, Kansas City won the Super Bowl and they didn't have a top end receiver, right? The value of receiver isn't that big a deal, right? Because Kansas City did it.
Yeah.
And just thinking about that, it's just fundamentally different, right? Travis Kelce, proven tight end, right? Hall of Famer.
Sure.
Obviously Pat Mahomes, but really it's like Andy Reid.
Yes.
Right. There's so much experience with between Spagnuolo on the defense for Kansas City and Andy Reid on offense. What do you think? There's 50 plus years of play calling experience between those two.
Yes.
And then you look at the Bills and where they're at. Like it's looking like you're going to have Joe Brady and Bobby Babbage calling plays. So now it's 2 years compared to 50 plus, right? So 2 years experience. It's just not going to be the same result if you are negligent on receiver. That's my thoughts on this. Can you agree? Do you agree with that at all?
Absolutely. And so the first thing I would start with is Kansas City didn't have a quote unquote roster rebuild until after they won their first Super Bowl. And actually, I would say their first two, you could say, right? Their first Super Bowl allowed them the leeway to do whatever the frig they wanted, right? They could have said, you know what? We're not paying anybody anymore. The owner's going to sit back, collect his revenue, and, we're done. We just don't care. We have Pat Mahomes. We'll figure it out from there. We'll still win games. We'll be profitable. And that's pretty much what they did, except they have so much talent that they're able to win and still, build around with just a couple of hits. And hitting in the draft, speaking of, is something they've done very well with, right? They've found these guys, a lot of them that I wanted the Bills to draft, that ended up turning into starters for them who are under control, which gives them flexibility to pay Chris Jones and pay everybody else, right? So their roster, quote unquote, rebuild, they were working with borrowed money, stolen money, basically, right? Like free money. Here you go. Everybody, we already won the Super Bowl. Our fans are already happy. We don't have anybody to please, right? There's nowhere to go but down anyway. We won. So they end up, yes, they came back. They won again. Credit to everything you talked about. The coaching staff, Patrick Mahomes, Travis Kelce, having the core there, and the fact that their defense came up 3 notches, right? Their offense, this was by far, without a doubt, unobjectively, or objectively, Patrick Mahomes' worst season by far, right? Worst statistical season by far. The offense, the worst statistical output season by far. And they did it on the strength of the defense. And as you said, the strength of their playmakers like Travis Kelce,
Right.
Mahomes, and Andy Reid as your coach, right?
Well, and Isaiah Pacheco, right? I mean,
he had a big role running
I think
back.
It was 2 years ago they kind of went from this high-flying offense when Tyreek Hill left, to a run-first team, what it felt like.
Yes.
Basically to open up opportunities for, the receivers and Pat Mahomes. But yeah, last year, to your point, it was very much defense, right? I think defense won the Super Bowl for them or carried them through most of the season, right? But when you're looking at Buffalo's roster rebuild, and we always hear people compare it to Kansas City, it's just not the same, right? Because you can't rely on the defense next year with where they're at. We don't know, right? And we're not going to know. Is that the plan with Brandon Beane and company? It could be. But I mean, obviously there's going to what we know though is Kincaid's probably the focal point of the offense as it is right now. And
Yes.
James Cook's going to get more carries. I think that's all we know at this point.
You think he's going to get more carries? I mean, they're probably going to run the ball more. I'll agree to that. I think they want to mix it up a little more than just give them to James Cook. But yes, overall, run the ball more, sure, and, spread the touches out. Yes.
Right.
So
because you're looking at right now, you look at the receiver core and you go, there's nothing we can do right now.
Yes.
Curtis Samuel's your number one. I mean, you can't work with that.
I mean, even if it were worst case scenario, I think you can work with that. I don't think it's ideal. It's not ideal, but you can work with it, right? I still stand on the fact that I think the Bills could walk in today and play a game if they had to. It's not the roster you want it to be. It's probably better than the one we had in the playoffs with all the injuries and everything. So, just with guys coming back from injury, that's going to be a boost to the roster overall. But yes, it's not good enough yet, but it's very good. It could win games. It could win the division right now in my mind, but you want it to be better. You want it to be the best it can be. And it's certainly not there yet.
Yeah. I feel like the offense isn't better than last year. And what's frustrating about that right now, as we get into these draft scenarios leading up to that, we don't really know yet, but, it feels like, we just got Josh Allen to a point, got the offense to a point where we don't have to run everything through Josh Allen, right?
Yeah.
There was games that were won with just running James Cook. There's other people stepping up outside of Diggs, outside of Josh Allen. And now it feels like we have to go back to everything through Josh Allen.
You don't want to have to do that. Yes, right.
Yes.
Right.
We spent so much time trying to get away from that. And now it feels like we have to go back to that. Right. And that's why this draft's so important. And the receiver that you do draft is important, right? Because it feels like Josh is the only one that's going to be making plays, right? Obviously, Kincaid will make plays. But when I'm talking with Diggs out of the picture, it's like, oh, we're back to Josh. It's just Josh.
On offense, yes, the unproven factor of, what is Samuel going to be with Allen, and who else is going to step up. I mean, you have to give some credit to the guys who were there last year, right? So Shakir, I mean, the guy is a ball magnet, right? He just catches it. He just catches it no matter what, right? And I think that'll play a factor as well. Now, he might get more coverage given that Diggs is gone. Somebody's got to get open. And Allen, yes, it's going to be him who's making the plays right now. And he could use the wide receiver weapons, to your point, in this draft to help kind of stack the odds in his favor. If you could get a guy who can go deep down the field and you can get a guy who can be a true, route running pass catcher, Geez, I'm talking myself into our draft picks right now. I think I just talked myself into Xavier Worthy and Lad McConkey, right? But anyway, we'll get to those options that are out there. But if you can pick up two of those guys, even if it's one in the early rounds, one in the later rounds, to balance what you need to have a multiple faceted offense where it's not just Josh making plays, and you have somebody who's a speedster who can make a big play, and you have running backs obviously who can make plays. That's going to at least alleviate some of that pressure on Josh. You can't rely on a rookie coming in day one to be a playmaker like that level. Like, nobody's going to come in and be Stephon Diggs. Now, they can produce in this offense, given the fact that there are all those other pieces we talked about, Kincaid, Shakir, Samuel. Somebody's got to cover them, and that could leave opportunities for whatever young receiver gets out there. So you do want that kind of the guys who are going to balance this roster and help alleviate the pressure from Josh Allen. It's still all on Josh Allen, really, but he's got to, having some options out there is going to make it easier for him to be the one making the plays.
Yeah, and I think the other thing we got to point out is if we're truly going with a rookie receiver, assuming it's one, and this will get into my point later, but the talent level of that receiver is important because the drop off from Davis and Diggs to Shakir and Samuel is pretty big. And I understand, okay, Khalil Shakir plays in the slot, Davis plays in the outside, but I mean, those options, the continuity, understanding the system, all those things, it puts a lot of pressure on Joe Brady. All the pressure now comes through the play calling, right? Because there's not a talent, like a number one receiver to turn to. You kind of have to balance out the offense. And maybe that's Joe Brady's strength. Maybe that's what they build towards. But really, that's going to put a lot of pressure on him.
Agreed. Yes, right. I think that the pressure has already been on him, right? He's been in these conversations and knows what's going on with getting rid of Diggs and how do you start to formulate your own offense. He took over the offense. Now he's got to make his own system. What do you want? What's going to fit best for you? I mean, it's not like they can give him everything he says, right? Because obviously he'd be like, go get me, Justin Jefferson and put him next to it, and all my problems are solved because you got Justin Jefferson. But if you can go out and say, okay, we're limited to the draft, we're going to get somebody for this offense. What do you think would fit best? Here's our thoughts. Joe Brady is going to say, look, yes, I want to run majority 12 personnel, and I need a really good speedy X receiver, or I need somebody who can run routes tightly and catch balls, right? And they're having those conversations in-house. So I would say that this draft is going to put more on the shoulders of Joe Brady in terms of expectation to step it up from last year. He did a great job last year in my mind. Now, because it's his offense and he's had a full off season to implement it and to say, okay, these are the changes I want to make. And we've seen those bold changes come out and play, right? In play for this offense. Bring in Samuel, Diggs is gone. We'll see who they bring in the draft. Maybe that means more on the tight ends, more for Shakir. He's going to be the one dictating that and calling those plays on offense. So, I'd say a lot of the pressure on the season right now. I mean, other than Sean McDermott, obviously, as the head coach, it's always under you. But Joe Brady is certainly, the expectations are going to be higher for him, and the pressure is going to be higher on him.
Yeah, and Josh Allen, to that matter, right? To that point.
Absolutely.
Both of them, the pressure's up now, where maybe last year it wasn't I think so high.
I would say, though, obviously with Josh Allen, the majority of us have confidence that Josh Allen can do it by himself with you and I playing receiver at this point, right? He's just a superstar and he can do that, right? The question is now, can Joe Brady get the most out of Josh Allen and this offense, or the best version of Josh Allen in this offense? And I think, that's where the pressure comes in, because if he doesn't, then, it's not going to look good for him.
Mm-hmm. And Josh, in the prime of his career, the question is, how do you get Josh to the next level, right? Mm-hmm. And that's not just this year. When we're looking at the 3 to 5 year plan, how are we going to get Josh Allen to the next level, right? How are you going to get Josh Allen over the hump in the playoffs, right? And, my stance on this. I've always been, why can't Josh Allen, get a ton of weapons and go after the passing touchdown record, which I think is 55, but there's an extra game now. Right. And I know, like, I'm not Do I think Josh is going to break the passing touchdown record? No, because he runs a lot. But like, why not build a roster on offense to go after that, right? If that's your strategic goal, right? The decision making is easy. Who's going to give Josh Allen more points, right? Like, I would argue speed or an all around receiver. Playmakers, yards after catch, like,
Yes.
You look at that Denver Broncos team with Peyton Manning, they just had wide receiver talent everywhere, right? Yes. Why can't the Bills go after that? And that's kind of what I think when I look ahead 3 years, look ahead 5 years, and this draft is the first part of that new plan, right? So it'll be interesting to see like what they're thinking. Is it balance? Or is it just give Josh the best weapons we can? Because I would go with best weapons we can over balance.
Right. And well, that's true from the offensive perspective, but you also have to take into account we still have a defensive head coach, a new defensive coordinator he's new in that position. He's been on the team, and all of that turnover on defense that would lean in the favor of, the Bills are going to go defense when they can, because they load up on defense and they need more on defense. From an outside perspective,
right?
You and we follow the Bills. We know,
right?
Before anything happened this offseason, what did we say? I mean, wide receiver was my number one priority, no matter what, right? Like, we need wide receiver. Even with the addition of Samuel before Diggs left, we still need wide receiver, X receiver. Now that Diggs is gone, I think it only emphatically hits on that point that wide receiver is the biggest need on this team. But you could still fill holes on defense, and they're still going to look at the board when it comes to what edge rusher or defensive tackle might be there. I'd say safety. I know a lot of people have them picking safety. Safety's not going to be till 4 or later, right? So give me the other guys in those rounds, the top type playmakers, and I could see it playing out. But wide receiver is without a doubt, has to happen in those first 2 rounds.
Absolutely, and I think the AFC where it is right now, it's an arms race. You look at what Zay Flowers did for the Ravens last year. You see what Jamar Chase did for Joe Burrow the last couple of years. I mean, and again, the Bills need to be in that kind of category where let's get as many weapons as we can versus let's model Kansas City, because again, the play calling experience with Kansas City is just next level, right? But then you look at like Miami has 2 receivers, 2 really good receivers. You look at like a team like Jacksonville, like who's your Calvin Ridley?
Right. Yeah, that's a great point. That's a great point, because
we don't have a Calvin Ridley.
That does take them to the next level, right? And that is a solid type of guy that you need. That's a perfect put him in the box type scenario. We're not going to get Calvin Ridley, obviously, but if we could get that type of guy who can emphasize and highlight things that we don't do right now and make it even better, that would be an awesome piece to add. But those guys don't grow on trees either.
Exactly.
But the point is, that's the kind of impact you'd like them to have on your offense. Jacksonville stuttered at times, even though he was the star, basically taking over for Kirk, who became their number 1 wide receiver the previous year. But even next to that, right? I don't want to be the Jacksonville offense. Don't get me wrong. I want a piece that fits like that. I don't want to be the Mahomes offense either, because we saw what that was with the receivers they had. They didn't step up. None of those guys did. None of them. You could talk about Rashee Rice all you want, now that he's got off the field problems, but he didn't step up that much last year either, right? And yes, they got it done. That's because, and situationally too, right? Their entire division collapsed around them. Nobody even contended with them. Had they had people contend with them in their division, then they wouldn't have even probably made the playoffs. But because they make the playoffs, that's where your X factors come in. You have coaches who know what they're doing. You have Patrick Mahomes, who's who's the most clutch player in the NFL, right? You have all those guys who are going to get it done, and they did, and they had their path in front of them. They made it look easy. And I mean, that's a totally different scenario. Everything worked in their favor. They are the luckiest team in the NFL. It takes luck to win a Super Bowl. They're the luckiest team from last year. They stunk. They had a terrible season. They were able to win the division. They were able to go to the playoffs. They were able to beat teams on the road. And, that's why they won the Super Bowl. And you got
their defense played great.
Give me that all year, right? You give me that kind of coaching reliability, that kind of experience, that kind of knowledge and play of the game. you're going to take this roster right now and you'd win the Super Bowl if you made it to the playoffs, right? So the improvement, the steps that we can take are only going to help alleviate the fact that Kansas City has us in those other categories.
Yeah. So before we get into the next topics here, are you team trade down or trade up?
Would
you trade back to the second round, or are you trying to get up for one of the top 4 guys?
No. Yeah. So I would say this much. Yeah. I don't think it's I would love to get a Dunze. He's my favorite player in this draft. He was one of the early guys I wanted. I'm like, this guy. I mean, I know Marvin Harrison Jr. is who he is, but a Dunze was my favorite then from months ago, right? The first guy I watched, I'm like, oh, this guy. But we knew he was going to be a top 10 pick, likely, right? So I do not think that the Bills will give up the capital it's going to take to go up and get a Dunze. I just don't see it happening. Would I love it if it happened? Sure, but I'd be very nervous if they had to give up next year's 1 along with this year's 1, and probably a 2 somewhere in there as well. That's a lot of mortgaging for one player, no matter what, one quarterback.
But so the argument is, if you're going to do it for a receiver, right?
Yes.
And just looking back on some of the trades from the later part of the draft up to the top 10, top 12, the Pat Mahomes pick, the Bills traded back to 27. Kansas City came up to 10. The Bills received obviously 27, 20, a third round pick, and a first, the 2018 first.
Yes.
So, when you say you'd have to give up next year's first,
that's
probably true. You do have 3 2s between this year and next year. So that's on the table as well. Maybe you can keep your first. But I guess what the question is, how much are you willing to give up? You said you weren't willing to give up.
I don't want
next year's first.
Yeah, I don't want to have to give up both. And that's likely what it's going to cost.
Right. So that's my other bullet points. What's the 3-year plan? You got to look at that, right?
Yes.
Is it to take a receiver every year, right? In the top 2, first and second round? Or because again, we're looking at, okay, if we stay put, the talent gap's lower, right? And if you trade back, the talent gap's even lower, right? In the eyes of the NFL as they pick, right? Doesn't always work out that way, obviously. If sometimes there's diamonds in the rough, but
yeah,
to me, if you're going all in for Josh Allen, the prime of his career, you're one play away every year from getting to the championship game, having a real shot at the Super Bowl, and you're coming up short. I think you got to be aggressive.
Absolutely.
Why not give up next year's first? You have 2 2s next year. I think you do it. Why wouldn't you? We know that the defensive side of the ball, we know they need a rebuild also, but we also know Sean McDermott is extremely capable of drafting and developing players in the later rounds, or some thought after free agents who come in and revitalize their career. We've seen it over and over and over again.
Sure.
I think you got to be aggressive here, right?
I'll tell you why you don't do it, because you can't, right? Because the very well scenario that I see playing out right now is the top 3 are quarterbacks and the next 3 are wide receivers. So, I mean, you're not getting past 8, right? With a Dunze, and he's the only one I'm willing to give that up. So that's why I say I just don't see it playing out. I don't see, even if Bean was like, you know what, I'll give up whatever they ask, they're going to ask and say, no, like we don't want your first round picks next year. We want Rome Odunze. We want Malik Neighbors. I don't think the Bills are interested. I wouldn't do it for Neighbors. I do it for Odunze. Obviously, you do anything to get Marvin Harrison Jr., but again, I think assuming those 3 quarterbacks go 1, 2, 3, whichever order those 3, whichever quarterbacks you like, go 1, 2, 3, which is, most likely my scenario anyway. And then, at 4, if the Cardinals either trade or, whatever, that's probably going to be
where
Harrison goes.
Right. Sure.
And then you've got, teams behind them like the Chargers, who desperately need a wide receiver 1 now.
They drafted one last year.
Yeah, well, he's not their wide receiver 1. He could be their 2.
But draft a guy in the first round, you're looking for him to be
much
1
later.
Or 2.
You're talking
but
again.
They want to shift to, running the football, kind of model in Michigan. Everyone's going, 7-on-7, but they kind of go against the grain and they want to run the football and develop play action, right? So they could go guard, they could trade back. I think what you're not taking into account is there's going to be a team that trades up for a quarterback. At least that's what it sounds like.
Yes, right. Like that. Yes, Minnesota
So
could
that's
very well be
4.
interested.
And I think the Chargers are, I think they'd be interested in Minnesota's 2 picks.
Maybe, and they could get one of these other receivers later, right? So you're right that very well could happen. The best case scenario is 5 quarterbacks that I think go in the first round, all go in the top 10, right? People trade up and you take them, right? And that's a possibility because there's those teams that are competing for a quarterback are going to know what it's going to take to actually get the guy they want. And those first 3 teams, whoever they take, are likely going to be quarterbacks, right? So then if you're sitting at 4, the Cardinals are going to call every team interested and say, hey, what will you give us to come up? Or they're going to say, no matter what the offer is, we want Marvin Harrison Jr., and then you move on from there. But that's why, even if he makes it, say that Odunze makes it, the Giants are likely to pick a wide receiver in my mind, especially if Neighbors or Odunze is there. The Giants aren't giving up anything to not get a wide receiver. Is all this quarterback talk to me, I think they're rolling with what they got for one more year in order to add a piece like Odunze or Neighbors. Because even if they stink this year, they've lost nothing. They know they got to get a quarterback, and then they're moving on the rails with what they got. So I just think they're most likely to go a wide receiver in my mind if one of those guys is still there again.
Right. But they could look around. They have a lot of other needs, and they're really questioning their quarterback, right? So why not give Daniel Jones one more year?
I don't believe that.
Why not trade out, gear up for next year's draft to get up and get a quarterback where Daniel doesn't work out? If he gets injured again, he's done, right?
I don't think they take quarterback. I don't think the Giants are.
I think they trade. They're available to trade out, though. I think
or to let somebody else get a quarterback. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, the receiver argument's obviously a good one for the Giants. Because Saquon Barkley's out now. Who do you turn to on offense, right?
Yeah, especially
why not be a receiver? Yeah, exactly.
Those 3 are playmakers, right? Yeah. Those are guys you can. I think that's what Daniel Jones needs in that offense, because that's been the biggest criticism of this Giants offense is they don't have receivers. You brought in Waller, who's retiring or whatever's going on there, who didn't work out his injuries.
It's a mess there for sure.
If you add a guy like that, then you really see what you have in a Daniel Jones, and then you move on next year when it's more cap friendly to do so. You're not going to draft a quarterback. Sure. Screw your team and be done anyway for this year. It doesn't make any sense to me. I don't think that's the direction they're going. I think they're going to stick with Daniel Jones, draft a wide receiver, and make it work, right? And that's what they should do in my mind. And that means, even if Odunze, let's say best case scenario, where 8, 9, 10?
Well, I think
maybe?
Let's see. You missed 7, which is Tennessee.
Yeah, I think they're going offensive line.
Offensive tackle. Joel
very well for them. He should be a top 3 pick, but he's not this year because of the
quarterback. They luck out.
Yep.
And this is hypothetical, obviously, but they luck out. Atlanta, they're loaded on offense, right? They need defense.
Yeah.
But they could trade back. Why not?
Very well. Yeah.
If you like multiple guys, why not get some extra picks? It's a new head coach in there too. It's a new quarterback, so those extra picks will help them.
Yeah, that's true. I could see them saying, what? The cornerback that we like best will probably be there at pick 20, so we're going to trade down and,
So then you have number 9, Chicago Bears. And this one's interesting because they only have 4 draft picks in this entire draft. 2 of them in the top 10. So, I mean, depending on how you want to build the roster around Caleb Williams, you might want some future picks for that, right? So they're a good trade candidate as well.
Yeah, but if you add Caleb Williams and Rome Odunze and you already have a Keenan Allen,
sure.
I mean, you're rolling, right? You're rolling.
But then that's your entire draft. You still have to build
that's all
a defensive line. Then you have a defensive head coach. So it's interesting. But there's options there for Buffalo, right? There's options there for Minnesota, who has the 2 first rounders.
Are you doing it?
They're going to trade up.
Are you doing it for Neighbors in your mind? So I've already said like Odunze is the guy that I would go up and get. But would you do it if, say, Odunze was taken before Neighbors and Neighbors is still there at 9? Are you considering it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Because Neighbors is the do-it-all kind of guy. I think it works for a place like Buffalo as well. Like, not a lot of distractions for him, right? It's just football, right? So it's the process. But I mean,
true.
Look,
but have you seen him live streaming and all that? Like all the stuff he does, his personality does not fit the McBean way. That's what I think. Like he's just
Well,
they just moved on from a diva wide receiver. They really don't need another guy who's going to be
any receiver
all
that
crazy
becomes a number one.
yes.
Let's say Josh makes a receiver a star, right? It's going to be diva. That's just how it works.
Well,
but,
we'll talk about the guys
from
later in the draft. If you remember some of them, I mean, I've seen interviews with some of them, and I think that those are the guys that make, McBean and McDermott McDermott and Bean get really excited about, right?
Sure.
So they're
guys who do their homework. I understand. But we need talent, right? Malik
true.
Neighbors is the most talented receiver in the entire draft. If he had the pro
all around
bloodline, he would be the first one off the board, in my opinion.
Okay.
But when it comes to the guy can do it all, right?
Yeah.
The speed, the size, can catch it any route, right? He's a matchup nightmare for defenses. And the Bills need that, right? It's not, you got a quarterback in his prime.
Yeah.
I don't think you can go light in this position and where the NFL is today, right? You got to play Miami twice a year, who scores a lot of points. And I know Bills beat them in other ways, but you still have to play them twice a year, right? You got to score points. You need someone to make a play versus Kansas City in the playoffs. A guy like Neighbors can do that for you, right? He can move the needle in the offense, right? So, I would trade up there. Where Brian Thomas is where it gets weird, right? Because you might not have to trade up so far.
Right.
But again, I think there's a lot of other teams looking for those top four guys to slip a little bit. The Colts come to mind, right? Anthony Richardson coming back from injury, big arm quarterback. You're going to want a guy who can get down the field, right? Brian Thomas fits that mold. So it's competitive at that point. And I'm not sure if the Bills would be so high on Thomas if Neighbors, or if they had the opportunity to trade up and get Neighbors or one of the top three. They're all in if that's the plan.
You definitely explore that option more. Yes,
right.
I would agree with that. Yes.
The gap between Thomas and somebody you can maybe get in late first round, it's a lot less, in my opinion.
Yes. So I would agree that I'm still high on Brian Thomas Jr. I'm not super high. I'm not trading up to 10 or something to pick him. But if you're telling me this is the Kincaid situation from last year in my mind, right? Brian Thomas Jr. is still there. Another team might be looking at him. You're like, hey, we could go up 4 or 5 spots, give up a third or, whatever next year, something, whatever the team wants to move up 4 or 5 spots to get that guy, you do it. Because again, I just love the way he tracks the ball deep. We've talked about him a lot on our show. And he's still one of my favorites in terms of upside, potential, and what he can produce right now, right? And the way he looks on the football field. He is a football player all around. Like he can do everything at the position, I think. And that excites me. There are some critics who say, well, he does the same thing. He just runs deep and catches the ball. He doesn't, run tight routes or whatever, but he wasn't really asked to do that. And I think that he has the potential to be able to do it. You see him catch the ball on the sideline. He's so aware, right? And that awareness is going to be there for running routes. And so I think he has upside and he's a good impact player now, which is why I would be willing to trade up 4 or 5 spots, give up something late, not nearly as much as going up to get one of the top 3. But you're like, you know what? This guy can impact our offense the way we want. He's got the upside to be a true number 1 moving forward. He's worth doing this, right? So that's where I'm at with Brian Thomas Jr. I've heard for some reason his stock in terms of media coverage and everything is going down, but that's fine. If he falls to 28, then it's just a gift in your lap, but I don't see that happening.
His film's good, but the question is he's one-on-one all the time because they got Neighbors on the other side of the field, right?
Mm-hmm.
And he's really a true X receiver, right?
Yeah.
So can he do everything? Remains to be seen because he was only asked to be kind of straight line speed, X type receiver things. But yeah, so there's question marks on him. Would you trade up for a guy like him? I don't know. Because personally, like I said earlier, the gap between some of the other X receivers like Troy Franklin, they're kind of similar in a lot of ways. So like you could just replace, but a guy like Neighbors, they don't make humans that way, right? Who can do it all for you and for your team. So to me, I would trade up for a top 3. I would want Thomas to fall and trade less. I wouldn't mortgage the future for him.
Sure. No.
But yeah. Anyway, sounds like we're on the same page.
Agreed. And the counter to trading at all up for Brian Thomas Jr. is that they also seem to like Troy Franklin, And I like Troy
Right.
Franklin
Well,
and he seems to be going more in the second round. So that's where, exactly. Trading
right.
back could be the best case scenario where you're like, you know what, if we can get this same receiver that we like in the top of the second round and get more for it, let's do that. We'll get a second round this year and a third round, because we don't have a third round
Right.
pick
Right.
for somebody trying to move back into the first round. And you don't want to go too far back into the into the second round, right? But I think that on paper, this is always the smart option. Again, we've been covering the draft for at least 6-7 years now, and we say the same thing every year, right? Oh man, there's a really good crop of players in that second round level that, you don't really want to be picking at the bottom of the first because you're really picking a second round guy anyway. So if you could trade back and get all more second round picks, that's the best thing you can do. Get 2 second round picks and a third round pick. That's where the talent is. And a lot of times that does play out in terms of where the talent is, but not in terms of the trade scenario, because if you're likely wanting to trade back, then other teams are more likely to say the same thing. Hey, our guy's still going to be there when we're picking an early round 2. So why would we trade up to get him now when we can get him later? But there are scenarios where I could see this absolutely being a good fit. Say one of the big defensive players is there and the Bills are like, you know what? We'd love to have that guy, but we're going to talk about the trade value of some other team coming in to say, we need this defensive player who's still there, right? Maybe one of the cornerbacks, because the Bills don't necessarily need a cornerback in round 1 in my mind, or if one of the edge or defensive tackles is there, it's going to be hard, but the Bills still could say, oh, there's another team who wants that guy more, who's willing to come up, and we could still get our Troy Franklin and defensive tackle round 3 guy.
Yeah, and you got to go receiver round 2. That's one of those 2 picks in round 2 would be a receiver.
Absolutely.
Why not take receiver with both picks in round 2 in this scenario?
Yeah. I mean, you could very well do that. I've seen that happen in a few mock drafts now. It seems like names like Ladd McConkey and some of those other guys, Xavier Worthy and Troy Franklin, are all going in this early round 2 area now rather than end of round 1 necessarily, right? So if guys like that, depending on the pulse of the draft, Bean can make that decision and say, hey, we could end up getting a Ladd McConkey and a Troy Franklin, damn, that's exactly what we need. We got the down the field guy, we got the route runner, or the opposite, Xavier Worthy and
Xavier
Legette, right? Take both Xaviers and you're good, right? Xavier Legette is
this from John. Thanks,
yeah,
John.
It definitely a great option, right? You could end up with, imagine picking Xavier Legette and then Xavier Worthy in the same second round. I mean,
yeah. Well, the problem is here's the problem I have with the trade back thing. Look, the value would be right, and I'm all for that all the time. But I feel like this is a pivotal year, right?
Mm-hmm.
Receiver needs huge this year,
mm-hmm.
and the difference. And I know Sammy Watkins always comes up, but the difference is you have Josh Allen in the middle of his career, and you're rebuilding, kind of this second wind,
yes,
on offense, right? You got to go all in for my guy. You know what I mean? Like, I feel like trading back and taking a receiver, it feels like settling to me. All these receivers in round 2 have question marks. And, the odds will say, okay, 43%, one of the studies I saw, 43% of receivers drafted in round 2 are successful in some way in the NFL, right? But that means, okay, we take 2 receivers in round 2. One's going to be successful, maybe. But again, there's
better
limitations,
odds.
right?
50-50.
Troy Franklin can't run the full route tree, right? Xavier Worthy, we don't know if he can get off the line and get open, right? Maybe he's jammed at the line and he's ineffective, right? And this is where it gets weird for me. And the Bills are in this scenario too. And I know the rankings are different in different websites. The NFL teams, all the rankings on receivers will be different.
Oh, yeah.
But it feels like they're sitting there at 28 and there's the really good receivers. And then there's all the ones with question marks in round 2. There's really not somebody there at 28, right? So,
yeah,
you have to, if I'm Brandon Beane, I'm trying to trade up as hard as I can for my guy, Josh, right? Do right by him.
Wow. That would be exciting. You're taking the all in and I would love it, right?
All but I think if you think about it logically and you're looking around the AFC and going, wow, the Ravens have been successful because they took, I know Bateman didn't work out so much, but they're taking swings in the first round at receiver. Seems to be working out for their quarterback, right? We know the Jamar Chase story. We went through it already once. what are you doing for Josh?
I really like your
You know?
point that they could give up next year's first, this year's first, and still say, you know what, we're sitting on 3 this year's and 2 next year's second round picks, which is an okay place to be because we just talked about how there is a lot of talent that falls into that second round. And one of those, for the one from Minnesota currently, could be a top pick, right? A top 10 second round pick versus where we would expect the Bills to be hopefully in the bottom of that round, right? So I do like that idea. That does convince me a little more that, you know what, if they're willing to give up some of those, maybe they could package it in a way where it's this year's first, next year's first, a fourth, a fifth, a sixth, because we've got all these late round picks that they could, put together a good package that makes sense.
Yeah.
And a team is willing to take to get up in that position.
Right.
Maybe the Bears,
and look, they're going in all the details on every receiver. They're meeting them in person. They might like a guy and it might be round 2, and that's fine. They think they can develop this receiver into a number 1, right? And that's something we'll never see on the outside, right? So that piece is missing. But, I mean, you look at Leggett, I mean, he's phenomenal talent, but he just hasn't played a lot, really. Like, okay, it took him a long time to develop in college. He had really one good year, right? So there's so many question marks there. Will he transition to the NFL? Same thing for Troy Franklin. I mean, he was much more successful in Oregon, but again, really wasn't asked to do a lot, just outrun everybody, and that's what he did. Well, you can't outrun corners the same way in the
Correct.
NFL, right? So there's question marks, there's question marks for every receiver. But I mean, if it's a pivotal year, I like the idea of trading up, but we'll see what they end up doing. It's going to be a lot of fun. All right, and then the last scenario, if they stay at 28, this, like I was talking about earlier with the gap, right? Okay, it feels like the top 4 guys are going to go in the top 15. All the other receivers, maybe except for A.D. Mitchell, going round 2, early round 2, late round 1. Does it feel a little bit like if the Bills stay at 28, it puts them in a position to reach for a receiver?
Yes and no. So, yes, I think it would not surprise me if they took Xavier Leggett at 28, right? Because they're like, you know what, that's the guy we like. Or if they took Ladd McConkey at 28, because they're like, hey, we don't want the Chiefs to get a chance at him later, and he's the guy we like. And I would consider that somewhat of a, quote, reach, right? Because we just talked about the fact that they're likely could still be available in the early second round, and people wouldn't be surprised at this point. However, if my worst case scenario, if you will, for me personally, is they're at 28. the receivers, those top 4 are gone. There's a number of guys they like at wide receiver, but there's one defensive player who they're like, you know what? You can't not get Chop Robinson right here, right? And at 28, Chop Robinson makes sense to me, right? Or some other player that's fallen. Insert your top defensive tackle or edge of choice that falls.
Well, let's say a guy like Verse falls to 28 for some reason.
My God. Yeah, I don't see that happening. I don't.
But
yes. But yeah, that's another one where you're like, that's the worst case scenario. I think they would still put priority wide receiver first to say, like, okay, we really like this guy. Andy's still here. We have to take him, even though a guy like Verse is still there. You're taking position over value at that point. It's not always best player available, despite what they tell you. However, I do think that if it's like, you know what, we kind of have these 5 guys all ranked the same at wide receiver, and this player is a difference maker, we got to take that guy, right? And I could very much see that playing out where they take an edge or tackle, likely an edge, at 28, just because they've fallen so far and it's amazing value and they have that player high ranked, and the next batch of wide receivers is all the same to them. Now, I think if that happens, then they would be looking to move up in round 2 to make sure they get one of those top wide receivers that they wanted that are all around the same, right? And they would get aggressive in doing so. You might give up one of next year's seconds. You might give up whatever it takes to get up there and get one of those guys, because then you can't miss on all of those guys.
Right. So, and we've talked about this a lot. Like Brandon Beane, before the Diggs trade, he had the roster in a really good spot. It felt like you can take the best available position, right, at 28. But with Diggs leaving town, now it's like you need a receiver. I don't care how, I don't want it
even more so.
Like, there's urgency at that position. Yes. Is what I'm saying. Like, and that's what causes teams to reach for talent. And I think you're seeing that a lot.
Yeah. I mean, how
right?
much of an impact is an edge player going to have on this team versus a wide receiver right now? Wide receiver
Exactly.
is going to
What
have way
moves the
more
needle?
impact. Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. For this team in this situation with this quarterback, wide receiver is a way more important need than edge, despite what the roster or what the value chart may tell you. Right. So I could see, only because it's McDermott and, it's his guy. Oh yeah, we love this guy. And somehow he fell. We're going to take him. That's going to make the fan base go, well, you better have a backup plan for getting back up in round 2 to pick the wide receiver that we need. Because if we
Right.
don't end up with one of those guys, and again, I will reiterate, I talked about it last week. I don't think there's any way the Bills draft A.D. Mitchell. I don't think they're interested in him because of his, play on the field, his attitude. Again, I just don't think that 50-50ness or I'm not ready. I'm not interested in taking A.D. Mitchell. So and same with Keon Coleman, right? A lot of guys, we've talked about him enough on this show. That to me is like, you're too much 50-50. There's no way I'm taking Keon Coleman and investing, heavily in that to make sure that's not the guy I want. I don't want a 50-50
Well, I mean,
guy to
both
be
those
the guy
guys
that we're
though,
relying on.
they might need a little development, but they can both become.
Absolutely. They have high ceilings, but
They
I
have high
don't want
ceilings,
you. We
correct?
can't play that game. Just like I talked about with Brian Thomas Jr., he has something he can contribute now. I think
Right.
no matter who drafts him, he's going to contribute now. He could
Right. So
contribute now.
your team trade up. That's what you're telling me.
Maybe, but
Yeah.
but I'd be perfectly happy with both Xaviers or Lad McConkey and Xavier
Well,
Leggett or
yeah,
whatever
okay.
combination you want in the second round as well.
You
So I'm
don't
team
like
trade
okay.
down first, if
Yeah.
anything, as long as the guys are there. Every
Right.
scenario depends on what the board is in that
Yeah.
moment. So when I'm live on here talking on draft night, you will hear my exact best case scenario of what I think it'll be. But right now, I would say I'm more trade down than I am trade up, because I just don't think, I'm not convinced.
So you want to trade back to the second round, to be clear, right? But you don't like Keon Coleman. You don't like A.D. Mitchell.
No.
Who do you like? I mean, this is where
Xavier
it gets
Leggett,
weird, though,
Xavier
because
Worthy,
but they all have question marks
Troy
in
Franklin.
round 2.
Correct.
All of them have question marks.
Correct, but I like them as better fits for the Bills right now. Troy Franklin could come in and be the speed that we need, be the just go down the field, get open, do your thing. Just like I said about Brian Thomas Jr., very comparable.
Well, he could be Gabe Davis all over again, right? And that's not good enough at this point.
You're right. I agree
right?
that that's not good enough,
Yeah.
but I think he
Thing
could
with
be
Troy
better.
Franklin, super fast, right? Definitely could do the option route plays, but when it comes to the route, you just haven't seen it on film, right? Because Oregon's offense and things like that. That's why they do private workouts and stuff like that to get an idea. Can this guy evolve? How fast can he evolve? But that's where they are with him. But like Keon Coleman, athlete, I feel like his talent shows up play after play. Maybe doesn't have the top end speed, but really can
he
body
get open? He's always covered, though.
He'll win the contested catch. But his play speed's a lot different than his 40 time too, I think.
True. Yeah. I mean, I agree with that too.
Yeah.
He's definitely better. And I've said before, I'm a fan of Keon Coleman. I do think he'll be a success in this league. I just don't think the Bills, in the situation they are now, have the luxury of taking a player who has some question marks like that, right? Every player has question marks in their game, but that's too much of a boom or bust, right?
But you can't have it both ways. You can't say, let's trade back and get the value right, but I don't want a receiver with question marks.
Boom or bust. I'm not talking about question marks. Every player has their question marks. Boom or bust. If you draft Keon Coleman, you could be getting absolutely nothing, and that's not good enough for me. If you draft A.D. Mitchell, you could be getting a guy who plays absolutely terrible because he doesn't want to be there. I don't want that, period. That risk, even if it's 10%, is not something that the Bills are capable of doing right now. If you take somebody like a Troy Franklin, sure, he might not be able to run routes the way you want him to and be as crisp, but the guy can get open downfield, and he's going to have an impact on this team regardless, because he can get open and he has speed, and as long as he's healthy, he'll do that, right? Same thing with some of these other guys, right? Xavier Leggett and Lad McConkey, very good route runners, have good hands, power, right? You're talking about fitting a hole that the Bills kind of gave up with Diggs in terms of his crisp route running and ball catch ability. And that's going to happen. Yeah, they're not speedsters. Yeah, they could get beat. Yeah, we don't know how it's going to translate to the NFL quite yet. You could say that about every player, but I like those guys and I like them as fits. And I'd be fine if they take one of those guys at 28 but that still leaves a role for me in terms of, my ideal situation is, you take Ladd McConkey and you take a Troy Franklin, or you take Ladd McConkey and you take a Xavier Worthy, whichever guy you want to fit in there. Take the X speed, take the route running ability. I really want one of Leggett and Ladd McConkey. That's what I've talked myself into. You give me one of those guys who has the sure-handedness and the route running and, the pieces that we really lost in Diggs. Nobody's going to replace Diggs, but the pieces that we already thought we had and lost, now you complement that with a true X-type receiver like a Xavier, or, Xavier Worthy, if you will. But I'm more worried about his size than I am Troy Franklin, because of the production he's had, against defenders. So, yeah, there's questions on everybody, but that's where I'm at in terms of what are you looking to get out of this?
Yeah.
And where I think the Bills are going to go, by the way. I kind of merge those two things now, right? I would be perfectly happy if they trade up and get a Dunze or even Neighbors. But my logical, this is how Brandon Beane and McDermott do it, mind is telling me what's most likely is to get a Ladd McConkey or a Xavier Leggett either in round 1 or early round 2, and then also complement that with another receiver either in 2 or 3 later on.
Or take a cornerback at 28.
I'll set the world on fire if that happens now.
Just the last thought, though. I think, if the Bills like McConkey, then another team's going to like McConkey, right? Chiefs are after the Bills.
Exactly.
Baltimore's after the Bills. San Francisco's after picks after the Bills. So if those question marks get answered, if you meet Xavier Leggett and you like his persona, you think he's coachable, you take him first round, right? So, so
and
trading back's risky in that way too. If you do have your sights set on somebody.
Remember, I said on this show that Xavier Leggett, who was at the Senior Bowl, when he performed there, he did an interview on NFL Network. I heard him talk on NFL Network, and I said, this guy is immediately on the Bills' radar. I don't care. This was before he was even moving up boards. But as soon as I heard him talk, I'm like, oh, my God, McDermott and Beane are going to cream their pants talking to this guy because he is, on point. He's just, I got to go out there and work, and I got to get it done. And, it's on me to do this. And, he just had all of the factors you want in a player, or they want and I want in a player, just the selflessness, the working hard, the attitude, and the play on the field. I immediately said he was going to be on the radar. So I would not be surprised if they take a guy like that at 28.
Yeah. Well, he's on everybody's radar. I mean,
now he is. Yeah. Because he
220 pounds, 4'3", 40. I mean, there's a lot to like there, right? There's a lot you could do with him. Again, it's just the questions. Why did it take him so long to get, productive in college? He did play in a pro system, which is another bonus at South Carolina. But yeah, there's a lot to like about all these guys. It's just getting the value right. And I'm always going to say, let's be aggressive for Josh. Let's go get him an impact player like a Jamar Chase, like a Zay Flowers, So I'm team trade up. Sounds like your team trade back, but also okay with trading up, which I
would be more surprised if they traded up. But man, if we get Dunze, man, you better be excited. Right?
Yes.
Nobody should be like, oh, I can't believe they did that. But you can be surprised, but you cannot be negative about a move like that. I think that's where I'm at.
That's fair.
Maybe where most Bills Mafia is at.
But I feel like you can't afford to settle for round 2, right? You want to remain competitive. The goal is to get Josh Allen a Super Bowl, to bring a Super Bowl to Buffalo. You can't settle. When other teams are being aggressive for weapons, like Baltimore, I think you gotta be aggressive as well. That's where I'm at with it. I don't like the Kansas City model where you're just going to neglect receiver and hope for the best. And Josh Allen will do everything because we just spent 3 years, Brandon Beane and Sean McDermott getting criticized for not helping Josh enough.
Yes.
Right. And it's worked out really. Like they've been really good. They've won a lot of games. But last year they finally had some balance, and now it feels like it's going to be unbalanced again. So I think you gotta be aggressive and try to trade up.
But to your earlier point, right? Receivers hit in the second round, right? There's a ton of top receivers who were drafted in the second round. So maybe that's what they're thinking. And they're like, you know what? Even though these top 3 are absolute home runs, if we don't get one of those 3, trading back is what makes sense, because round 2 in this deep wide receiver class and in combination with the fact that round 2 is where receivers tend to hit, then, maybe that's the way to go and pick up 2 in the second round and make it happen,
Yeah.
But that's why I'd be happy with that situation too. Maybe not on night 1 of the draft because you're like itching for the pick and it doesn't happen because they trade back. That's going to be much less exciting on draft night than the trade up for the top guy.
Yeah. All right, let's move on. We do have an O-line segment we want to get to here. I'll try to rush through this, but the question was, do the Bills have a need on the offensive line, right? And it sounds like they don't, right? Mitch Morris being traded away. I thought maybe they would look at some of the centers in this class, right? There's 3 first-round centers. Powers Johnson, Zach Frazier, questionable. He's kind of sometimes second round. And then Graham Barton out of Duke. That's going to fall to the Bills. Like in most mock draft simulators, like one of those 3 guys is there. So would you take a hard look at that? Was kind of what we were going to get into. And when you do trade, right? Like we talked about the value where the receivers are the top 4 are, gone in the first 15. The other guys you think have a second round grade on. What do you do? Well, there's going to be so many offensive linemen on the board at that point that you kind of have to look and see what are we giving up if we do trade back, right? And really the offensive line's in a great position as far as what's on the Bills roster, right? I think Connor McGovern going to center, it's a good move, right? He's a pro. He's been so good at left guard. You hate to see him move, but I think he can definitely handle that position. I don't think there's a lot of question marks there. The more question marks are around David Edwards playing left guard. And that's where would we want to draft somebody there to maybe compete, right? That's probably the only need, right? Deion Dawkins gets re-signed. Spencer Brown still under contract for one more year. I don't think he had a horrendous year where he's going to lose his job at right tackle. So there's no questions there. You got to look at depth as well, right? With Ryan Bates moving, there's, you kind of want to fill some of that depth pieces. They did sign Will Clapp. They did sign Lyle Collins, who we talked about last week. Still have Tommy Doyle in the building. Alec Anderson, if you remember him.
Yeah, lots of depth.
Yeah.
And
I probably you'd take a tackle in every draft, right, for those depth pieces.
Absolutely.
I don't see a scenario where they would look at tackle or guard or even center for that matter early, right?
Yeah, I would agree that even if those guys are on the board at this point, minus the Diggs, now that Diggs is gone, I think it's truly a situation where that has now, and they signed Lyle Collins as well, right? So that added depth piece, they have the numbers there that protected them from even considering having to take a guy early in the draft in the first round. I do think they could still handle getting a center guard type player, ideally a guy who plays both later rounds, right? You're talking 5th, 6th, where we have those, compilation of picks in this draft. I think they could go for that. And I haven't dove deeply enough to be like, this is the guy I think they're going to draft in round 6. But I do think that if there's a center or a guard who plays center too, that's the type of guy who's going to be on the radar for the Bills in terms of adding that last bit of depth that they maybe don't currently have, or to be competition, or to come in and, okay, this is a guy who has a high ceiling and could be a starter someday, because there is that turnover in the middle of the offensive line. You want to have some competition for Edwards at guard. You want to have somebody who could come in if Edwards gets injured, and still have depth behind him. So you need 3 guys really at each position, and you do that in a combination of ways.
Yeah.
And I think that that's one of the ways you can make that happen is drafting a guard center later in the draft, and maybe even a tackle at one of those as well. And likely those are going to be guys who either make the practice squad or are cut, depending on, injuries and all of that, the factors that come into play.
Yeah, it does feel like they need a little bit of depth at guard. The interior defensive line or offensive line feels like it's a bigger need than the tackle position, right? So you're probably looking for somebody who can play center, guard, right? We know they like versatility. They're always looking for versatility, and that usually works out well for them, right? For the Bills, right? I think a couple years ago we kind of did the math on this, and they carry one less roster spot because they have a versatile player who can play guard or tackle, right, or center and guard. And I think that's worked out well for them. They've got a lot of draft picks like through trades for some of these depth pieces. So yeah, just wanted to run through maybe a couple targets for the Bills. These are all depth players, right? They're sleepers. I only have 4 here because watching offensive linemen makes me sleepy.
Get the sleepers for the offensive line.
Yeah.
I like it.
But yeah, just some guys who can fill that role, right? That substitution, backup role, but can also be in some packages. Maybe we saw Ryan Bates do that a couple years ago. Or if the center goes down, knock on wood, maybe an option to plug and play there. Cooper Beebe out of Kansas State. This is funny too because I wrote their rankings, and it's kind of funny because you look at all the sites, right? There's PFF, ESPN, NFL, all these draft sites, these reputable draft sites, and this guy's ranked from 28th, his highest ranking, all the way down to 123rd. So it just shows you the variation in how scouts watch the film and interpret it, right, and to give their perspective. It varies a lot. But yeah. BB, pass protecting guard. He's very versatile, can play tackle, can play guard, probably can play center as well, right? So all 5 positions, which we know that Brandon Beane and McDermott are going to love.
Oh, they would, yeah.
High IQ player. A lot of people, some sites think he's a plug and play, but definitely needs more work on technique and then more consistency and balance, which is causing him to fall a little bit. A guy like this is versatile.
A good offensive line coach who could help him out with that, right?
Right.
Let's get it done.
Yeah, so a team might fall in love with that, and the Bills might not have a shot at him because we're talking round 4, right, for the Bills, right? I don't think they do something like take a backup player in round 2,
right?
Unless there's a bigger plan, which I don't think is the case right now. They re-signed Deion Dawkins. Everybody on the line is going to be here for a while, right?
Right. So I wouldn't call him as much of a sleeper as I would a slider in some people, because I think he could go in the second round and people wouldn't be surprised. 4-year starter, versatility. I mean, that's all you need to know. He's in the draft. He's a 4-year starter and he can play. Somebody is going to fall in love with that. I think likely to be 3rd round in my mind, more than second.
Yeah.
Because there's just too much of that talent that we just talked about that's falling into the second.
Right.
Going to push him maybe to the 3rd or maybe end of the second if somebody really goes for it. But if he were to fall all the way to the 4th, I mean, why not? 4-year starter who can rotate in, I'd take him.
Right. And it's funny because guard always surprises people too in the draft. They're like, oh, didn't see this guy on the radar, but he ends up in the 1st round somehow. So really, it's that variation in how the teams have him ranked. And sometimes it's extremely wide, right? Zach Zinter out of Michigan. Not obviously a national championship team, right? Ran the ball a lot. He only allowed 9 pressures on 389 pass blocking snaps, right? So definitely has some talent in pass protection. What's kicking him back in the rankings is severe leg injury, injured his fibula and tibia in late 2023. So he's going to be a slow developer, and there's questions around, does he still have the mobility? Kind of struggled with that before, but still, with that leg injury is going to be recoverable, right? So I think
I actually think that makes him more desirable for the Bills because he's one of those guys that you could potentially stash on an IR, and give him that kind of red-shirted first year of, he's not ready to go. We're going to rehab him for a whole year of learning. And then next year, he's really going to be somebody who could compete for us. That might have been, a top drafted at his position had he been fully healthy when we got him.
Right. You'd also have to look at, can he play left guard? Because I think the right guard position with pretty Torrance solid. Is locked down. Or maybe can Torrance move to left guard? But those are questions, if this guy ever does become let's say the Bills draft him, stash him, develop him, he becomes a starter, where's he going to play, right? That's a big question. But his rankings between 62 and 157. Huge gap.
Big gap. Well, let's hope it's the latter. And he's still there for the Bills.
All right, Christian Mahogany, maybe the coolest name in the draft. Left or right guard, ranking 63 to 200. So again, but he does have the versatility to play left or right. Really a run blocking guard, right? If you're looking to transition to more run plays with James Cook, and you need depth in that area, I think this is somebody you want to look at. He's out of Boston College.
There you go.
Did tear his ACL in 2022, and came back, right? So he showed that he was willing to put the work in to work back and keep playing football. So that's something you got to do as a pro, right? But yeah, run blocking tight end who seems to be a little underrated. So somebody the Bills could look at here. And then we talk about center, right? The three centers that are going to go early, right? But then there's like a huge drop off, and there's really you're probably looking at guards who can play center at that point. But
yes.
Cedric Van Pran out of Georgia, interesting player here, and his rankings are interesting because he's as high as 37.
Oh,
right, and as low as 107. So he's a little bit higher. Like the range is a little bit lower than the other players, but still pretty wide.
And in that system, right? You're talking about Georgia. That's you're playing against the guys who are going in the NFL, right? And you're getting the snaps against in a quality offense, so that plays NFL style offense. So I like that about him, right? And again, my fear is somebody that with that much experience at that institution, coming from Georgia, an NFL team is gonna say, you know what, we need this guy on our team more than the Bills will.
Right. And the Bills signed Will Clapp, which tells you they probably won't go this route. Right. But he was a team captain with a high football IQ. But that says a lot about if you're a Georgia Bulldog and you're a team captain, that says a lot. But just concerns where the gap is lateral quickness, right? Being able to attack those gaps with speed. But yeah, just some sleepers that we dug up just to kind of fill our conversation about offensive line. Because again, when we developed this plan to have our series, it was like, O-line's got to be on there, and then a lot changed from then till now. So I don't think O-line's a huge need for the Bills. I think David Andrews, right? Am I saying his name? David Edwards.
I'm like, who are you talking about?
He's going to be locked in at left guard, and I think that's the plan, right? I don't see a scenario where the Bills, either bring somebody in or draft somebody who takes his job. And initially, I thought maybe there'd be a competition there, but I just don't see that right now.
Yeah, I mean, he'll have competition from the guys currently on the roster to make sure he's earned the spot, as always. But I agree that he's the most likely starter at left guard currently.
Any other thoughts about offensive line?
If it's okay to be concerned about the movement at offensive line and not have high level impact in terms of the draft with offensive line. I think that's my takeaway, right? It's perfectly logical for Bills fans to say, I'm not excited or I'm not happy about the offensive line changes that the Bills made, right? I think that's logical when you lose the guys you lost and you kind of go in a different direction. You had the best offensive line that worked for Josh Allen ever, and you changed 3 of the 5 positions. So it's, it's a little bit dicey after that. But at the same time, I don't think it at all makes it a high priority to get somebody in the draft. And that's perfectly okay to be in that position now. And I think they've protected themselves moving forward in a way where, say we don't extend Spencer Brown next year, that it won't be a super pressing need for them to be like, oh, they have to take a round 1 tackle now because they're not going to keep Spencer Brown. They've really got pieces that they've had in place to say, okay, this could be our succession plan, or at least bring somebody in to compete with the guys that we're going to have on this team moving forward. So I'm not as concerned about offensive line as some people, I would say.
Got a question from Hector. Can you see Lyle Collins playing left guard? It's a good point because he did play left guard early in his career, right? In Dallas.
Yeah.
But he's played so many snaps at right tackle with the Bengals and with the Cowboys later in his time with Dallas. I think he's brought in to back up Spencer Brown. He could play left guard. I think that's a decent point that he could do that, right? But he's at this point in his career, I think he's over the hill a little bit, right? He's had a lot of injuries. I'm not sure if to look at the contract, see is he going to even make the team, right?
Right. I think the Bills
That's a
took a
good
flyer
question.
on him, knowing that, again, maybe you could consider him a, fourth on your depth chart for going in at guard if you needed to, right? And sometimes with offensive line injuries, you need to get deep, right? So I'm sure that was something that they're like, in a pinch, you could be a guard, right? And that's okay. But in reality, you're a tackle. Or, who knows? Maybe they had the conversation with him at this point in your career. We don't want you to play tackle. We're going to bring you in as a backup only for guard, but that's less likely to me. I
Yeah.
think he's both mainly a tackle, but as we talked about versatility and how much McDermott and Bean love that, the fact that he can play guard and step in and contribute there if needed badly, right? I mean, it would have to be a bad situation, but having somebody who could do that is important too.
Yeah, he's got a lot of experience, right? So he helps the room out instantly. So yeah, it's a good signing. Why not? I think they got him at the veteran minimum, if I remember right. So
Well, it's like it's one of those up to deals, up to $6 million.
So if he does
He
make the
becomes the
team,
starter. Yeah,
get a
right.
certain amount of snaps. So that sounds like a depth piece, right? If somebody gets hurt, you have someone like that can kind of come in and play. But yeah, I did say Mahogany's the coolest name in the draft. I take that back. It's Keaton Bills.
What? There's a player named Bills?
Bills, last name. Guard out of Utah. Says back. He's way late, right? Could be undrafted, but coolest name, right? How cool would it be to have a guy with the Bills on a Bills uniform?
That would be that would make total sense. And he's a late round guy.
Right.
As I said, we need a late round guard.
Right.
That would
It's
work.
also like you could buy that jersey and keep it forever.
That's
even if
right.
He gets cut.
Yeah.
Well, it's just the Bills. Yeah.
What's his number? Do you know? It'd be like, number 70, Bills. Yeah, that's it. Just Bills.
Keaton Bills.
Most bought jersey for the Bills is Bills. That would make total sense. If he goes undrafted,
it's timeless.
I mean, if he goes undrafted and he signs anywhere else, it's not going to make any sense. But maybe the Bills will get him.
Yeah. Hopefully undrafted. Don't draft him. But yeah, thanks for tuning in with us tonight. Fun conversation about trading up, trading down. We're going to hit that again next week just because draft's 1 week away in our next show. Crazy to think about.
Wow, yeah.
So yeah, we'll try to squeeze in edge as well. Defensive line. Is that a need for the Bills? We'll dive into that. We'll come up with some more scenarios. Maybe relook at the receivers again and kind of see how the rankings have changed, right? There's so much stuff this time of year where things get a little crazy, but yeah, that's a really fun conversation. It's going to be a really fun draft just because receiver is a big need. It'll be interesting to see what the Bills decide to do because I think we beat it up pretty good in our conversation, right? The options are the options. How are you going to handle the scenarios, right? And it's always a really fun this time of year. So yeah, tune in with us next Thursday, 7:30, same time as tonight. Appreciate everybody's time. Thanks for participating. See you next week.
Always. Thanks for kicking it with us.